Buenos días de nuevo. Vamos a continuar ahora con la parte más después de esta introducción, de esta presentación, en la cual, por parte de Manuel, por ejemplo, nos ha hecho una descripción de todo lo que está ahora la regulación tratando en este momento. Vamos a dar paso, en primer lugar, a Matteo Craglia, que es analista, no sé dónde le veo, debía verle en algún sitio, de la OCDE, el Instituto International Transport Forum, está dentro de la OCDE y han publicado en el 2030 un informe sobre el transporte para el 2030 y pensábamos que esta era una forma de enmarcar donde estábamos actualmente viendo el mismo. Yo os voy a introducir a Matteo en cuanto le vea dentro de la pantalla, que supongo que tendrá que aparecer por aquí en estos momentos porque no ha podido venir a acompañarnos. Hi, Matteo. Thank you very much. Could you hear me?
I can indeed. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Okay, thank you very much for attending this meeting. It's a pleasure having you here. I think you are going to frame the situation of the international transport. I'm going to introduce you to the people and your CV here. No? Matteo Craglia is Transport Analyst and Modeler and ITF, International Transport Forum. It started in 2021, working there. He's also a researcher at Cambridge University Science and Policy Exchange. He worked also at the IIA too, the International Energy Analyst, as analyst in the energy efficiency and is contract agent in 2018. And he's a doctor of engineering and has a master's degree in energy technologies from the University of Cambridge. Matteo, thank you very much once again. The floor is yours, and maybe if they have some questions, I would like to give to him. Okay, go ahead, please.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And again, thank you very much for the invitation. I apologize, I'll have to speak in English rather than Spanish, but hopefully that's not too much of a problem. I thought I was invited today to give a bit also the scene-setting presentation, also to offer some global international perspectives on the importance of energy and transport in this decarbonization journey that we're doing. And I'll be presenting today the results of our 2023 ITF Outlook. These reports are done every 2 years by the International Transport Forum, and in it we aim to forecast transport demand globally, all countries and all vehicle modes, estimate how demand will expand, continue out to 2050, and also look at the emissions and other impacts that it will cause. And I guess the first finding is that unfortunately we are not on track to reach the goals of the Paris Climate Accord. We look at 2 different scenarios, a current ambition scenario and a high ambition scenario. And this graph shows you the total emissions from the transport sector in both of those scenarios. With current levels of ambition, current levels of policy that have been enacted globally, we forecast that we are at best likely to flatline CO2 emissions currently. So a much greater level of ambition globally is necessary for us to be able to keep the goals of the Paris Climate Accord, reduce emissions in line with pathways set out by the IPCC. But it is possible. And in this presentation, I'll hopefully show some of the ways that we can actually get there. So, as I mentioned, we look at 2 different scenarios. In our current ambition scenario, we include different global policies that are in place at the moment, but also we include national, publicly announced aspirations and commitments that are yet to become policy, but will hopefully be in place. And this forms our current levels of ambition. Our high ambition is basically we turn this up to the maximum that we think is politically and possibly feasible in many countries, to try and see where can we go, what is the potential for us to get and meet our climate goals. So the first, I guess, most important point is that clean technologies and clean fuels will play a very significant role in reaching the goals of the Paris Climate Accord. This figure shows on the left our current ambition scenario and on the right our high ambition. It shows you the total emissions from the transport sector, but split up by the different vehicles, different types of transport modes. What you can see is that passenger cars and heavy-duty road freight, heavy goods vehicles, account for a very significant share of global emissions. While there's also, we need to not forget about the aviation sector and the maritime shipping sector as well. Together, these account for the majority of transport emissions. When we look at individual sectors, we see that already, with current levels of ambition, emissions from passenger cars are already expected to decrease. As was mentioned, this is mostly due to a very dynamic situation in terms of electric vehicles that are really starting to be adopted at scale in developed economies. Many of the EV sales shares in Europe were mentioned before by the previous speakers, but also it's globally, I think in China it's now over 30% of sales as well, and North America is also catching up as well. So it's already a very dynamic pace happening in the passenger car segment. However, we don't see quite as much dynamism, quite as many emissions reductions set out in current levels of ambition in other sectors, in particular ones that are often referred to as hard to abate or difficult to decarbonize sectors. And these are in particular the heavy-duty road freight, aviation, and the shipping sectors. Whilst there are some now policies start to come in place, these are often in very specific countries or regions, and expanding that level of ambition globally will be the next big challenge. However, we see that with higher levels of ambition, emissions from all of these sectors can feasibly be reduced. Focusing now in particular on the passenger car segment, as mentioned, zero-emission vehicles are starting to take off. And the good news is that with current levels of ambition, current policies that are in place, such as was mentioned, the Fit for 55 in Europe, we already see a peak, a maximum of internal combustion engine vehicles globally, in the global fleet. And we forecast that zero-emission vehicles, in particular electric vehicles, will start to take a very significant share of the passenger car fleet. In a high ambition case, this can be further accelerated, in particular helping emerging economies to also adopt electric vehicles. However, we see that there will always be some residual internal combustion engine fleet, in particular in emerging economies, that will be quite challenging to decarbonize. If we instead switch focus to commercial vehicles, road freight vehicles, we also see things starting to happen here, but they're still at a lower level of ambition. So these figures show on our left the current ambition and on the right the high ambition for light commercial vehicles, so think about vans and things, in red, and heavy-duty vehicles in green. And what we can see is that there are already a growing number of countries that have started to set out targets for zero-emission heavy-duty road freight. Many in Europe and North America have signed, for example, the Global Memorandum of Understanding on heavy-duty road freight. But there's still a lot more scope for more countries to commit to these high-level targets, and for then policies to be put in place to help stimulate the adoption. Things like purchase incentives and other schemes to help stimulate the adoption of heavy-duty vehicles. And in particular, it was also mentioned by other speakers, is the key importance of stimulating infrastructure deployment for these. We're already starting to see some of these policies starting to be put in place throughout Europe as part of the Alternative Fuels and Infrastructure Regulation, AFIR. It is very important, one, is setting out the targets and the ambition, but the second is then following through and actually delivering it, which will be a particular challenge. It will require a lot more collaboration between the transport sector and the energy sector, in particular with electricity grids, helping to move from being reactive, moving from being incremental to instead using more foresight and sort of building in anticipation of demand and not only waiting until it's too late, until we've run out of capacity on electricity grids, for example. The good news is also that we see within the market for zero-emission heavy-duty vehicles is changing very quickly, and we think we've done quite a lot of analysis also on this topic, and we see that in particular electric heavy-duty vehicles are set to be cost competitive this decade, and with further policy support, that level of uncertainty can be reduced, and the years of parity in terms of cost competitiveness can be brought forward. So it's really important to both help put these policies in place to guide that transition and put the infrastructure in place to help support it. I thought I would focus also quickly on the different regional differences. So this again shows you our total levels of emission, but this time split by Europe, which you see in blue. In red, you see other OECD countries, such as North America, Australia, Japan, but also adding in China. And in both of these regions, we see that emissions are already, from transport, are already on a downward path, particularly due to new technologies being adopted at scale with current levels of ambition. However, it's really important to note that emerging economies are currently not yet on the path. They are expected to have very significant travel demand growth. We expect travel demand to more than double in emerging economies. And therefore, if there's one takeaway that I can give away today, it's that in the developed world, also I'm speaking here from Paris, we have a particular responsibility to accelerate as much as we can, to be able to give also slightly more time to emerging economies to be able to support them to begin their decarbonization pathways. Low-income countries are dependent on older fleets. They're often dependent on used vehicle imports, and so they will need more time and support to begin their decarbonization pathways. In this outlook, we also for the first time started counting up the investment requirements for our different scenarios. And in particular, this figure shows the total level of transport infrastructure investment that is needed in each of these scenarios. Think about refurbishing roads, building motorways, building railway, but also building the energy infrastructure for these. And we see that this differs quite a lot in different regions. Regions in which transport demand is set to expand very significantly, such as low and middle income countries, are expected to build a lot of infrastructure over the next 30 years. So it's really essential to help support them to ensure that this infrastructure is sustainable, helps to support moving towards more sustainable modes of transport, moving towards rail where possible, towards public transport where possible, to avoid lock-in of emissions, to avoid urban sprawl and a dependence on the passenger car in particular. The other interesting insight is that moving towards helping to promote sustainable mobility within infrastructure investment will actually, we model, cost less. It will cost 5% less in our high ambition case than it will in our current ambition case. This is principally because it will require potentially fewer roads, less road maintenance costs in particular, and these can actually help alleviate some of the burden in terms of costs to governments. We also looked at then some of the infrastructure investments in particular for electric vehicle charging, and we estimate as a back of the envelope that it will likely cost between 10 to 20% of all infrastructure investments in the transport sector. So it's very significant. It's not to be under-evaluated. It's very significant, but it's not impossible. And these investments that in many cases will likely pay for themselves, but it's very important to help align and structure these investments towards this sustainable future. moving, as I mentioned from before, instead of being reactive, to start thinking strategically about the types of infrastructure, grid strengthening, like. It's also important to highlight that we expect that some of that charging infrastructure, potentially a third of those investments, could be for heavy-duty vehicles as well, which is very significant. But again, you get a lot of emission savings from that. So again, important to think about also moving forwards. Finally, in terms of policy recommendations, we see a particular importance, I guess, broadly in developing comprehensive transport strategies to ideally reduce private vehicle use and move towards sustainable modes where possible. There will always be limits to how possible this is, and in particular, there will always be necessary technologies and fuels to help complement that. But in developing these comprehensive strategies also help to strategically align transport investment, and as we said, can actually lead potentially to savings. I mentioned before also the importance of accelerating emissions reductions from these hard-to-abate transport modes that have so far not yet received a sufficient level of policy attention, but we see that this is starting to change, and this is another key point that I would like to urge. And then more broadly is helping within, there's going to need to be a lot of infrastructure investments to help support the new low-carbon future. And it's really important to help align institutional investments towards these sustainable transport pathways. Think about multinational development banks, helping in particular emerging economies to support them on the journey, and accelerating our own journey as much as possible to give them a little bit more breathing room. To help emerging economies, it's really important to help focus on technical capacity building there. And as a final point is really start thinking about how to future-proof infrastructure where possible. These are just some points, and I'm very happy to answer any questions you may have. Our report is publicly available. You can download it with the following QR code. And if you have any questions, also feel free to send me an email. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matteo. It's very interesting, your presentation. If somebody would like to ask something to Matteo, some questions here or in the Zoom or something. Maybe, Matteo, you can comment if you have some insights about the IEA Net Zero report put out yesterday. No, this is a question I haven't asked you, but this is something we are now commenting here because the general director of our Minister of Ecology Transition talk about this. How can we get 2030 all the goals in the climate area? No, and one of them, of the many issues, this is the transport system. Do you have some comments or something? I haven't asked you before about this question, but it was just right now, yesterday, and this is the question. Hi, Matteo.
No problem at all. I haven't quite had the time to read through it in complete depth, but we work very closely together. We're sister organizations.
Yeah, because you work there, no?
We're both, exactly, we're both housed at there. We often compare different scenarios. I mean, generally we see that it's also quite aligned to what we have in the International Transport Outlook with the ITF as well. We often share lots of information in terms of transport travel projections. But I think broadly it shows how dynamic it is in terms of industry and how many opportunities there are within this, how quickly things are changing. That new industries are popping out of, I guess, things where 5-10 years ago we didn't expect would be feasible. And this, I guess, also shows the importance of international collaboration, really starting to think and challenge historical assumptions. An example is how to decarbonize heavy-duty road freight. 5 or 10 years ago, nobody thought that electric vehicles would be feasible at all. It will cost too much, or the batteries will never work. whereas already now we're seeing mass production starting from many of the major truck manufacturers for electric trucks. It really shows how quickly things are changing. I guess, yeah, I'll leave it.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer. It was a pop-up question here, no? But I know you have a strong, very close relationship with them in all these reports they are putting out. Thank you very much, Matteo. Pleasure having you here. You are invited to come here, whatever you want to. Okay, thank you very much. Bye. Bye.